Speaking of aging, at the front end of what you just said, I want to go into that a little bit more. And I think most people will recognize that this is an enormous problem in the developed world, and we should talk about it through that lens because I think that's where it's most stark. But I'm curious as to whether or not you think this could become a problem or even plays a role in childhood obesity rates. So let's talk about what happens to a child that is protein deficient at the beginning of their life. What is the implication of that later in life?
So when I got into protein, John Waterlow and Joe Millward and Peter Garlick and Vernon Young were sort of the godfathers out there that I learned from. And I got involved with some international malnutrition with the U.S. International Agency for International Development, USAID project in Morocco. And so we looked at that, and that led us to doing some animal studies. And basically, we used the animals to look at malnutrition and recovery. And what we found was that malnutrition, starvation insults early in life would stunt muscle development, basically limited the DNA development, limited the cellular development, and basically stunted lean mass in the children and in the animals. And if that was stunted, basically what happened is the individual as an adult was always predestined to have low lean body mass and high body fat, obesity. And that was really the origins of how we started thinking about muscle-centric health. If muscle didn't develop right, if it wasn't metabolically correct, you were predestined to some of these other things. And I mentioned Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and that's sort of how we put that concept together is muscle-centric health. We've got to have the correct development and we have to have the correct protection as adults, because that's kind of where both your mobility and your metabolic health start.
Don, what's the mechanism? Do we have a sense of why, for example, maybe people are aware of this, but when you look at children in places like Africa who are really malnourished, at first glance, you almost pause and think, well, why are their bellies so big if they're malnourished, right? Well, and yet they don't realize that's an extreme, and I don't even remember. It was Kwashiorkor, was that the name of the?
Exactly.
Yeah. And what's the pathophysiology of that? Why is the extreme malnourishment lead to that protruded abdomen and things like that?
So there's sort of two directions that childhood malnutrition goes. One is called marasmus, which is sort of the skin and bones look, and the other is Kwashiorkor, which is that kind of a inflated belly looking. The belief of those two differences is that in Kwashiorkor there's disproportionately poor protein, and that leads to changes in water balance and edema. People have argued, is it cortisol based, is it stress based? But it appears to be an imbalance in the protein to energy relationship, where in marasmus, they're just short of total calories and total protein and everything. But in Kwashiorkor, it appears that the quality of the protein, they're eating these starchy porridges and things like that, totally deficient, probably in lysine and methionine, and that leads to water imbalances and other things.
And what is it about this critical window of development where this protein deficiency makes it very difficult for them to put on lean mass later in life and creates a propensity for adiposity?
So again, we actually did some of that original research. This was stuff we did way back in the late 70s, early 80s. Muscle is a very unique cell structure. We have what are called muscle fibers. And unlike a liver cell, which has a DNA, a nucleus in each cell, muscle cells are multinucleated. They have what are called satellite cells around them. And so as the original fiber begins to develop, the satellite cells will put DNA, these nuclei, into it. And what we determined was that each DNA has a certain amount of protein it can handle, And so what the DNA ultimately determines how big your muscle can get. And so what we determined was that late in pregnancy, early in lactation, if the insult occurs during that, you stunt these satellite cells and you don't develop enough DNA, so the muscle is always limited in its potential size.
Wow. I was aware of the propensity for adiposity later, was not aware of the limitation in lean growth. So this is really the double whammy, right? It's effectively lifetime
Right.
sarcobesity.
Yeah, so basically you're decreasing your lean mass, you're decreasing your metabolically active tissue, and so you're sort of stuck with minimal calories will deposit fat.
Now, look, in the U.S., it would be hard to imagine a child developing Kwashiorkor, but clearly there are kids in the United States that are disadvantaged enough that they're not going to be exposed to high enough protein in either quality or quantity. Do you think that there's, to a lesser extent, some of this problem that's going to happen in developed nations like the U.S.?
I think it's possible. Frankly, these are the kinds of things I worry about with the advocates of plant-based diets. We're starting to see New York City taking animal proteins out of school lunch. What is that really going to do? We're conducting a public health experiment without actually having any knowledge of that. I think that's frightening. And the issue is public school lunches, nursing homes, daycares. These are all under these federal guidelines where we're diluting out the quantity and quality of protein at the same time with no knowledge of what that's really going to mean. So I think that's pretty frightening to be doing that kind of public health experiment without knowledge of it.
Yeah, I hadn't even considered it through that lens, actually.